The organ of hearing and balance is the ear. We are able to hear a wide range of sound, and our equilibrium apparatus keeps the nervous system continually informed of head movements and positions so that we can maintain our balance. Although the structures for hearing and balance are located in the same area and are structurally interconnected, their receptors respond to different stimuli and are activated independently of one another. Recall that the ear lies within the petrous portion of the temporal bone. The ear consists of three parts: the external, middle and inner ear. The external ear consists of the auricle or pinna, which is composed of elastic cartilage. Its rim is the helix, and the fleshy dangling part is the lobule, more commonly known as the earlobe. The function of the auricle is to direct sound waves into the external acoustic meatus. The auditory canal is a short tube that extends from the auricle to the eardrum. The entire canal is lined with skin that has short hairs which screen out large debris, sebaceous glands and modified apocrine sweat glands called ceruminous glands. These glands secrete earwax or cerumen, which provides a means of entrapping foreign objects and repelling insects. Sound waves entering the external acoustic meatus eventually hit the tympanic membrane or eardrum. The tympanic membrane is the boundary between the outer and middle ears. Sound waves striking the tympanic membrane make it vibrate, and the vibration is transferred to the middle ear. Are bones or ossicles making them vibrate. The middle ear, also called the tympanic cavity, is lined with mucous membrane and filled with air. The posterior part communicates with the mastoid air cells and temporal bone, tympanic antrum. The mastoid process is a good place to check for conduction block and hearing deficits. The pharyngotympanic or auditory tube, formerly known as the eustachian tube, connects the middle ear cavity to the nasopharynx so we can equalize pressure between the middle ear cavity and external air pressure. When you fly in a jet, or drive up a mountain, you can feel increasing pressure on the eardrum and it is more difficult to hear. When you swallow or yawn, the auditory tube opens up temporarily so that the middle ear cavity can equalize pressure with the external environment. This permits the tympanic membrane to once again vibrate freely, and hearing is restored. The auditory tube is also a route by which infections can spread from the throat to the ear, and even reach the brain. Ear infections are common in kids because their auditory tubes are short and run more horizontally, whereas the auditory tubes in adults are longer and at an oblique angle. Inflammation of the middle ear is called otitis media. Extending from the inner aspect of the tympanic membrane to the inner ear are the three smallest bones in the body, collectively referred to as the auditory ossicles. The inner ear is also called the labyrinth because of its complex shape. It lies deep in the temporal bone and consists of the cochlea, which is involved with hearing, and the vestibule and semicircular canals, which are the sense organs of balance. The middle ear chamber contains the three ear bones, which are named for their shapes: the malleus, hammer, incus, anvil, and stapes, stirrup. The handle of the malleus is attached to the eardrum, and the base of the stapes fits into the oval window. Tiny ligaments suspend the ossicles, and many synovial joints link them together into a chain that spans the middle ear cavity. The ossicles transmit the vibration of the tympanic membrane to the oval window, which in turn sets the fluids of the cochlea into motion, which ultimately excites the receptors for hearing. There are two muscles that insert on two of the ear bones. The tensor tympani arises from the wall of the auditory tube and inserts on the malleus, and the stapedius runs from the posterior was of the middle ear cavity to the stapes. The stapedius has the distinction of being the smallest skeletal muscle in the body. When bombarded with loud noise, the tensor tympani tenses the eardrum by pulling it medially, and the stapedius impedes the vibration of the whole ossicle chain and limits the movement of the stapes in the oval window. The tensor tympani is innervated by the mandibular division of cranial nerve in trigeminal. Its contraction limits the movement of the eardrum, which protects against prolonged loud noises. The stapedius is innervated by the facial nerve. When the ears are exposed to loud noises, the muscle contracts reflexively to prevent damage to the hearing receptors, which are first-order neurons. Once killed, the receptors cannot be replaced. Hyperacusia is a condition that results if the stapedius is paralyzed. This makes noises seem excessively loud to the point of being painful. The inner ear is where the organs of hearing and balance are found. The inner ear is like a series of channels that are bored out of the temporal bone, filled with fluid, and contain a fluid-filled tube floating inside. Because the channels are similar to a maze, they are referred to as a labyrinth. The bony labyrinth consists of cavities running through the temporal bone. The bony labyrinth is filled with a fluid called perilymph, which is similar in composition to CSF. The membranous labyrinth are the tubes that float inside the bony labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth is also filled with fluid called endolymph, which is similar to intracellular fluid, but the electrolyte composition is different. These two fluids conduct the sound vibrations involved in hearing and respond to the mechanical forces occurring during changes in body position and acceleration. The vestibule is the central egg-shaped cavity of the bony labyrinth. Suspended in its perilymph and united by a small LL duct are two membranous sacs called the utricle and saccule. They house receptors called the maculae that respond to the pull of gravity and changes in the position of the head. The semicircular canals project from the posterior aspect of the vestibule, project in three directions: anterior, posterior, and lateral, and contain the membranous semicircular duct which communicates with the utricle anteriorly. Each semicircular duct has a swelling at one end called an ampulla, which houses an equilibrium receptor called the crista ampullaris. The cristae ampullaires respond to angular or rotational movements of the head. The cochlea is where the organ of hearing is located. We will consider the sense of hearing first. The cochlea is named after a Latin word that means snail because it is a spiral, conical bony chamber about the size of a split pea. The cochlea is made up of three fluid-filled chambers. In this diagram, a cross-section across part of the cochlea shows the orientation of the three chambers relative to each other as well as how they fit together within the bony labyrinth. The cochlea extends from the anterior part of the vestibule and coils around a bony pillar called the modiolus. Running through its center is the membranous cochlear duct, which ends blindly at the cochlear apex. The cochlear duct contains the spiral organ of Corti, which is the receptor organ for hearing. The cavity of the bony cochlea is divided into three separate chambers or scalae. Scala means ladder. The scala vestibuli is the upper chamber that ends at the oval window. The scala tympani is the lower chamber that ends at the round window. Both chambers contain perilymph. They are separated from each other except at the apex of the cochlea called the helicotrema. Running between the scala vestibuli and scala tympani is the cochlear duct, which is filled with endolymph. It is separated from the scala vestibuli by the vestibular membrane and from the scala tympani by the basilar membrane. In the outer wall of the cochlear duct is a structure called the stria vascularis. As the name indicates, the stria vascularis is composed of a highly vascularized mucous membrane that secretes endolymph into the duct. The spiral organ of Corti, which rests on top of the basilar membrane, is composed of supporting cells and hearing receptor cells called hair cells. The hair cells have numerous sterocilia, which are actually modified microvilli that protrude into the potassium-rich endolymph. The longest of the hairs project into the tectorial membrane. Sound is channeled into the external auditory meatus and strikes the eardrum, making it vibrate. This causes the malleus to vibrate, and the vibration is further passed on, and amplified, to the incus and stapes. The stapes vibrates and moves the membrane of the oval window in and out. Waves in the perilymph of the scala vestibuli displaces the vestibular and basilar membranes. This produces waves in the endolymph in the cochlear duct. These waves jiggle the basilar membrane upon which the organ of Corti sits. The movement bends the hairs, microvilli, of the hair cells that are embedded in the tectorial membrane, and the hair cells send an electrical impulse back to the brain via cranial nerve 8. Different sound frequencies cross the basilar membrane at different locations along the cochlea. High-frequency sounds have a short wavelength that displaces proximal end of the basilar membrane. Medium-frequency sounds displace the basilar membrane near the middle of the cochlea, and low-frequency sound displace the basilar membrane at its distal end near the apex. Nerve impulses are sent out the cochlear division of cranial nerve 8. From CN8, the impulses travel to the auditory or cochlear nuclei in the medulla oblongata. Most of the fibers decussate in the medulla oblongata before heading up to the thalamus. From the thalamus, impulses are relayed to the auditory area of the temporal lobe, number 41 and 42. Notice that different regions of the auditory cortex are tuned to different frequencies of sound wave corresponding to the cochlea. Some fibers don't reach the thalamus by end in the inferior colliculi. These fibers are involved with the orientation of the eyes, head and neck in response to auditory stimuli. Equilibrium is a special sense that is difficult to describe compared to vision, hearing, taste and smell. The sensory receptors for equilibrium respond to various head movements and send signals to the brain that initiate reflexes needed to make even the simple of change in position. There are two types of equilibrium. Static equilibrium is involved with keeping the head positioned with respect to the force of gravity, and dynamic equilibrium is for keeping the head positioned when it is subjected to movements. There are two types of dynamic equilibrium, linear and rotational. The sense organ for static equilibrium and dynamic linear acceleration and deceleration is the macula. Each utricle and saccule contains a macula. The maculae monitor the position of the head in space, and in so doing, they play an important role in controlling posture. Notice that maculae are oriented at right angles to each other, one being parallel to the base of the skull and the other perpendicular to it. This allows us to detect linear acceleration and deceleration in both the horizontal and vertical planes. For example, imagine sitting in your car at a stoplight. When the signal changes to green and you step on the accelerator, the maculae in the utricles respond to the change in horizontal position. Similarly, when riding in an elevator, the maculae in the saccules respond to the up and down movement. Each macula is a flat patch of epithelium that contains hair cells. The hair cells have stereocilia plus one kinocilium that project into a gelatinous mass called the otole. Thick membrane. Embedded in the mass are small calcium carbonate crystals called otoliths. The otoliths increase the membrane's weight and its inertia, resistance to change in motion. The hair cells synapse with fibers of the vestibular division of cranial nerve 8. When your head starts or stops moving in a linear direction, inertia causes the otolithic membrane to slide backward or forward over the hair cells, bending the hairs. For example, when you flex your head, the otolithic membrane slides behind, bending the hairs backward. When the head tilts, the weight of the rocks move the membrane. This bends the hairs, which generate and send impulses to the brain, cerebellum, etc. The receptor for dynamic rotational equilibrium is a minute elevation called the crista ampuaris found in the ampulla of each semicircular canal. Recall that each of the three semicircular canals is oriented in one of planes, anterior, posterior, and lateral. The anterior and posterior canals are oriented at right angles to each other in the vertical plane, whereas the lateral canal lies horizontally. There is a membranous semicircular duct filled with endolymph in each semicircular canal. Each duct has an enlarged swelling at one end called an ampulla, which contains the crista ampuaris. Each crista is composed of support cells and hair cells. The hair cells have stereocilia and one kinocilium that projected into a gelatinous mass called the cupula. The cristae respond to changes in the velocity of rotational movements of the head. Because of its inertia, the endolymph in the semicircular ducts moves briefly in the direction opposite the body's rotation. The flow of endolymph bends the cupula and excites the hair cells, which depolarize and send impulses to the brain at a faster rate. Bending the cilia in the opposite direction causes hyperpolarization and reduces generation of impulses. When the body is rotating at a constant rate, the endolymph eventually comes to rest. It moves along at the same speed as the body, and stimulation of the hair cells ends. If we are blindfolded, we cannot tell whether we are moving at a constant speed or not moving at all after the first few seconds of rotation. However, when we suddenly stop moving, the endolymph keeps on going, which in effect is like reversing direction. The sudden reversal in the direction of hair bending results in changes in membrane voltage in the receptor cells, and mod. A is the rate of impulse transmission, which tells the brain that we have slowed or stopped. Impulses transmitted from the semicircular canals are particularly important to reflex movements of the eyes. As you rotate, your eyes slowly drift in the opposite direction. This is because of the backflow of endolymph in the semicircular canals. Then, because of CNS compensating mechanisms, the eye jump rapidly toward the direction of rotation to establish a new fixation point. These alternating eye movements are called vestibular nystagmus, continue until the endolymph comes to rest. When you stop rotating, at first your eyes continue to move in the direction of the previous spin, and then they jerk rapidly in the opposite direction. This sudden change is caused by the change in the direction in which the cristae are bent after you stop. Nystagmus is frequently accompanied by vertigo or dizziness and inability to walk in a straight line. Information from the equilibrium receptors goes directly to reflex centers in the brain stem, rather than to the cerebral cortex. Impulses travel initially to one of two destinations, the vestibular nuclear complex in the brainstem or the cerebellum. The vestibular nuclei, the major integrative center for balance, also receive inputs from the visual and somatic receptors, particularly from proprioceptors in neck muscles that report on the position of the head. They integrate this information and then send commands to the brainstem motor centers that control the extrinsic eye muscles, cranial nerves 3, 4, and reflex movements of the neck, limb and trunk muscles, via the vestibulospinal tracts. The reflex movements of the eyes and body allow us to remain focused on the visual field and to quickly adjust our body position to maintain or regain balance. The cerebellum also integrates inputs from the eyes and somatic receptors. It coordinates skeletal muscle activity and deregulates muscle tone so that head position, posture and balance are maintained, often in the face of rapidly changing inputs.